black's a pawn up, but white gets the pawn back right now. Now the threat is, as I told you, knight takes knight, pawn takes knight, bishop takes pawn, check. But that's easily defended. What's the obvious way of protecting the knight on c6? Welcome to tonight's opening class. We're covering basic chess openings. When you learn chess for the first time, it's recommended that you start with this move where each player plays the pawn in front of the king up 2 squares. Notice how the pawns block each other. White's territory is the first 4 rows and black's territory are the next 4 rows. Now objectively, white gets to move first, so he has the first move advantage. He has a piece out before black. Black is therefore the defender. What black tries to do is to keep white from coming in his territory with too many pieces. Then white might be able to win a pawn or a piece or something. So the basic idea in an opening is you only make a few pawn moves to establish a position in the center of the board. That's why the pawn in front of the king or the queen are the most popular moves. And you always do the 2 moves. If you're white, you would be wasting a move if you only move the pawn up to king 3. So you want, as that pawn moves up, it gives you squares behind it for your pieces to move into, and it blocks the black pawn and keeps it from moving. Now the pawn on e4, of course pawns take diagonally, so the pawn on e4 covers the d5 square and the f5 square, those 2 white squares. The most important squares in the chessboard are the 4 center squares. And the next most important are the surrounding squares around the 4 center squares. They're called the near center squares. A lot of the strategy in chess is that the person who's most successful in chess controls more squares with his pieces than his opponent. Now the way you control more squares, you have to move your knights, bishops, queens, and rooks out into the middle of the board where they can impact squares on white's side of the board, and also white wants to impact squares on black's side of the board. So for example, take the white knight. It's traditional with this move that the next move for white is to play the knight to f3. So anyway, that knight attacks the pawn on e5, which is undefended. It forces black to defend the pawn. The standard way is to bring the knight to c6, capital N c6. So another opening principle, I could have moved this knight to c3, right? But I chose to move the knight to f3. Well, what opening principle told me to move the knight to f3? If you have a choice between 2 good moves and one has a threat and one doesn't, you pick the move that has a threat. Knight here doesn't threaten anything. Knight there threatens a pawn, forces black to make a defensive move. If you make attacking moves and force your opponent to defend, like in football, the defense doesn't score that many goals, right? Touchdowns. They don't make that many touchdowns. In chess, if you keep your opponent on the defensive, he can't checkmate you. He can't beat you. And the first move, and making threats and making your opponent be defensive, that's called the initiative in chess, meaning that you are initiating the aggressive action and your opponent is responding to it. So when chess starts out, you don't have a winning advantage. You have the first move advantage, and you try to maintain as long as you can by continuously looking for threats as you bring your pieces out. Sometimes there are no threats to be made, but then you figure out what piece goes to the best square in the shortest amount of time, and there may be no threat at all. It only comes in, you make the threat if you have a choice between a move with a threat or a move without a threat. Okay. Anyway, there's no great threat here. So we're going through the bishop to c4 line. Now there's two main lines for this bishop. Bishop here leads to the Italian game or the two knights. We're doing the two knights defense. Who knows what bishop here is? What's the name of bishop here? Spanish game, or the Ruy Lopez, R-U-Y Lopez, named after a Spanish bishop from the 1700s or something who popularized it. They're both good moves, and they're played today. They've been played for 250 years by grandmasters. So pawn, knight, bishop. You see, I got a pawn and two pieces out. My opponent has a pawn and a piece. So black doesn't fall behind in development. He has to develop a piece. He has two reasonable possibilities. He can bring the knight here and attack this pawn, which is undefended. Or he can move that bishop up here. That's a good development move, and it's comparable with what white did. If he brings the bishop here, that's called the Italian opening. If he brings the knight here, it's called the two knights defense after black moving his two knights out. Simple as that. They're both perfectly valid, and it's a matter of choice. Whichever way you like to play it. And I play both of them just for variety. But we're going to go over the knight one, because that's our subject tonight. Now, I told you white's attacking. Now, in this case, black makes an attacking move on an undefended pawn. So black's move is called a counterattack. White was the initial aggressor. Now black is counterattacking. The knight to f6 is a counterattack defense, whereas the bishop to c5, which threatens nothing, it's just a good development move. That's another standard, but it's not a counterattack. It's just a good developing move. Okay. So white has some choices. He could bring the knight here. That would be capital N to c3. From here, it protects the pawn, which is attacked. And in the future, it can hop up here to the center. He has to protect this pawn first by maybe putting the pawn here. And the pawns link up. It's called a pawn chain. They protect this pawn, protects this pawn, protects this pawn. Pawn chains are very strong pawn structures defensively. This is a very strong defensive structure. White, however, wants to be more aggressive. He doesn't care to have a strong defensive structure. He has the first move. He's going to be aggressive and attack black center. So in this line, he plays pawn to queen 4. Now, the pawn is protected by the knight and queen, and this pawn attacks the pawn on e5 and the knight. So black, the standard move is pawn takes pawn, and if white wants to, he can win the pawn back with knight takes pawn, and if knight takes knight, the queen takes knight. So he's got it covered. This pawn is protected twice. It's attacked twice. That's all you need to defend. If it was attacked 3 times, say that bishop was here, then this pawn would be lost, and pawn here would be a blunder. So black's move is pawn takes. Now, what did white get for this moving the pawn up? Number one, he got this bishop to come out. The pawn was here blocking the bishop. Now the bishop can move out. Number two, the pawn that was here blocking this pawn no longer blocks the pawn. This pawn can move up and attack the knight. That's number two. Number three, the pawn was blocking the queen. Now it's up here. When this knight takes the pawn, the queen has an open line up the middle of the board. This is called a file. They're not just columns, but they're called files. And because this is the queen file, it's called the D file. So white gets a lot with this move. Black has an adequate defense, though, and I'll show it to you. White doesn't take the pawn. He prefers to move the pawn up and to attack the knight on f6. Now the question I would throw out to the audience is, what is black's best move here? On the surface, see, you have appearances in chess. It's like a show and a play. You see the stage, or like a mystery play. What you see on the stage is the surface. It's what appears. But as you know, in a mystery, there are things happening behind the scenes. Somebody gets killed, somebody gets poisoned. It's beneath the surface. So in chess, you have what's apparent on the surface of the chessboard. And in this case, what's apparent is that pawn is attacking the knight, and the natural reaction is, by golly, I got to move the knight. That's the first reaction for black. It may not be the right reaction. So in chess, you have to look a few moves ahead. You have to consider all the possible alternative moves, because if you made a gut reaction that your knight's attacked and you moved it, that would be an incorrect move. You have to look beneath the surface, see what other alternative moves there are, and in this case, I'll point out one that's better than moving the knight. So here's how you look for an alternative move. The knight is threatened. You either move it or you lose it. But you don't, if you can make a threat just as powerful as his threat, white's threatening to win a knight. If you can make a threat to win a knight or bishop, then the threats are equal and opposite. That leads us to consider not moving the knight. Remember, I told you if you move the knight twice in the opening, it's a waste of time. You try to develop your pieces and pawns. It turns out there's an alternative move to moving the knight, and you attack that bishop by moving the pawn in front of the queen 2 squares. See how the pawn's protected by the knight and the queen. And if white takes the knight, black takes the bishop. Now this pawn can take that pawn, not a problem. Our bishop takes the pawn. And then our bishop is on a good square pointing to the center, and the king can castle, and the bishop, it's almost like 3 pawns. There's a pawn, a bishop, and a pawn, but the bishop guards the same square as the pawn does. It's perfectly safe for black. Turns out that it's a mistake for white to take the knight with the pawn. It helps black.
So what if the other knight took the pawn, instead of moving the pawn forward, black's?
Wait a minute. Let me go back. Right here. Now what are you saying?
If the other knight took the white pawn.
Well, then the knight on f3 would take the knight, and I would win a knight, which is worth 3 pawns for 1 pawn. And black would be, in effect, 2 pawns down. And remember, a grandmaster wins usually 1 pawn up. Even a lowly master can win almost every game if he's 2 pawns up. So that would be a gross blunder for you to take that pawn with the knight. You would earn yourself 2 question marks and a lost chess game. So pawn to queen 4 is much better. Or d5 is the algebraic. Pawn to queen 4 is the other notation. See how the pawn attacks the bishop. Now, you know you can do, when the pawn's on the 5th row and the black pawn moves past it, if the black pawn moved here, white could take the pawn, right? There's a rule in chess, if the pawn moves 2 and this pawn's on the 5th, white has the option of taking the pawn, as if it had only moved 1 square. That's the French term, pawn takes pawn en passant, which means in passing. The black pawn passes the white pawn on the 5th row. It only comes into play where the pawn moves 2 squares instead of 1. This guy has the option of taking the pawn as if black had moved it 1 square. So I could take the pawn and there would be no threat on my bishop, right? Because this would be gone. My pawn would be here, right? But if I take the pawn and my pawn's here, I'm not attacking the knight, am I? And he can take his bishop that hasn't moved and take my pawn. So I help him develop his bishop, and his next move he castles kingside, and he takes over. Has more pieces out than I do, and black's better. So pawn takes pawn en passant is a blunder. Not a huge blunder. Let's just say it's a bad move. The right move, since I can't take the pawn and taking the knight doesn't work, I have to move the bishop. There's only one reasonable move for the bishop, is to move here and pin the knight. The knight defends this pawn, and my knight's going to take the pawn with the bishop here. I'm going to threaten knight takes knight, pawn takes knight, bishop takes pawn, check, attacking the king and the rook. That's going to be my threat. Now he can defend it, but that's still my best move. So that's why white plays the bishop and pins the knight. Now that renews the threat of pawn takes knight. There are no other threats black can make. Black has to move the knight now. I'm going to leave it up to the audience to tell me where that knight should go. Any opinions? Look at each possible square and determine which one. Remember, the center squares are the important ones. You could retreat back to your starting square on G8. You could retreat in front of the queen on D7. If you go in front of the queen, you block the queen and the bishop on white squares, don't you? That would be a terrible move. If you moved your knight back to G8 where it started, we're trying to develop our pieces, not undevelop them, right? So retreating the knight to G8 is another terrible move. Somewhat less terrible, but not the best move, is knight to G4. It doesn't threaten anything, because you can't do knight takes pawn. He does knight takes knight, and your knight's pinned. So knight to G4 doesn't threaten anything. And I can attack the knight on G4 with my rook pawn up. He has to retreat the knight to H6, right in front of the pawn, in front of the rook. And then this bishop, which hasn't moved, takes the knight, and that pawn on G7, that destroys black's pawn structure. He has 2 weak double pawns, and that knight moved 1, 2, 3 times, right? 3 moves. How many times did the bishop move to take the knight? 1. That gives me 3 moves for black, 1 for me. I have a 2-move advantage I just got. In chess, that's called time advantage. That knight to G4 is a terrible move. There's only one good move. Notice there's a nice center square right here, protected by a pawn, and no pawns can attack the knight. The only pawn that could attack the knight is this pawn, but it's blocked. So it can't attack the knight. And even if it did, the knight could retreat over here. So the only move is to bring the knight to the center of the board. Now that's black's best piece. It just invaded white's fourth row, didn't it? Now white has a pawn on his fifth row. That invaded black's fourth row. It's defended by the knight, so it's still kind of even. Black has a knight invading white's territory. White has a pawn invading black. Black's a pawn up, but white gets the pawn back right now. Now the threat is, as I told you, knight takes knight, pawn takes knight, bishop takes pawn, check. But that's easily defended. What's the obvious way of protecting the knight on c6, the black knight? It's black's move. Who in the audience would like to give us the obvious protecting move? Yeah, and that's a standard and good move. I thought it was the only move in this position for 50 years. But when I bought this new book, because I teach young people chess classes, and I thought I ought to bone up on my openings, he comes up with a different move. So that is the obvious move, and it's played quite frequently, and it's perfectly good. It turns out there's a counterattack. So the defensive move, which is the one he just said, is you simply protect the knight and you break the pin. That's perfectly good. It also turns out there's another good move. Remember, you can defend or you can counterattack. There's a hidden resource here. Black can counterattack. And he plays here with his bishop attacking the knight. Now it looks like simply knight takes knight, pawn takes knight, bishop takes pawn, check. King moves, bishop takes rook. Black must have been out of his mind. He just lost a rook. That's the surface in chess. You have to look a few moves beyond that. Notice that the black bishop that went to c5 and the knight are attacking this pawn here. When this knight goes here, pawn here, bishop takes pawn, check, the king over, bishop takes rook, this bishop line is open, black does bishop takes pawn, check, forcing the king to move. Let's say the king moves here. See this white bishop here? This pawn's gone, right? It came here, and the bishop is here. That bishop comes here, checking the king. The king moves in the corner, blocks the rook. That rook can't get out. And then the queen takes the bishop. Now, white did get a rook for a bishop, but black got some pawns and has white's king stuck in a very bad spot. That's called more than adequate compensation. Black is winning that game. So bishop to c5 is a hidden resource that I didn't know about, and I've been playing chess for 50 years, but it's in that book. It turns out this resource has been known since 1934. Not to me, but grandmasters knew about it. There was a world champion contender in 1934 named Paul Keres from Estonia. He was in the top 10, not when he played this game. He was playing postal chess as a younger guy. He became a top 10 player. This is his game. So he knew about it in 1934. Anyway, white makes a dubious move here, castles. It looks like a fine move. It gets the king safety. The rook protects the f2 pawn, which is being potentially attacked by the knight and bishop, as I told you. We'll go see the problem. Now, after castling, white does threaten knight takes pawn, bishop takes pawn, check, and bishop takes rook. So that's a true threat. Black's not so much worried about losing one pawn, so black gives up the pawn and just castles. White wins the pawn and is threatening the rook, and the queen and bishop threaten this pawn, and once they take this pawn, they threaten the knight. Looks like black might be in some trouble. So if the rook moves here so the bishop doesn't take it, the queen can take the pawn, threatening to take the knight. And if queen takes queen, bishop takes, and the bishop threatens the knight. But there's a hidden resource. The surface, this bishop attacks the rook. Black thinks, I gotta move the rook. And if you do your initial reaction without thinking about your other possible moves, moving the rook is a mistake. It turns out, again, there's a counterattack. That bishop is attacking your rook. Your bishop can attack that rook. So the right move is bishop here. You don't waste time moving the rook without a threat. You make a counter threat, and the queen can now, if the bishop takes the rook later on, the queen can take the bishop. Plus you get that rook. This is fully equal. This is better for black. White is losing his first move advantage. Anyway, white takes the rook, and black takes the rook. Now, he took the rook. The rook was defending the pawn. Now black threatens knight takes pawn, protected by the bishop, attacking the queen, and if the queen moves, the knight can move somewhere with the discovered check on the king. White doesn't like that. He doesn't, nor does he like bishop takes pawn check, nor does he like the bishop retreating and then bishop takes pawn check. So he's going to stop bishop takes pawn check. He makes a gross blunder that loses the game rapidly. He makes the bishop to e3. On the surface, it looks good. The bishop protects the pawn, stops the threat. So what if they trade? That's what it looks like on the surface. Turns out this is the wrong move. His best move, and black's still better, would have been just king takes bishop. Then there would be no check here because the king is moved to a white square. Anyway, white made a bad move, so now black can weaken the pawns around the king with bishop takes. See how the pawn was here? There were 3 pawns in a row protected by the king. Now the pawn's up here. This pawn and this pawn are on black squares. They're undefended. That queen can come here, threaten queen takes pawn check, and queen takes this pawn. And the knight, if he comes here with check, and if the king goes here, the knight comes down here with check, attacking the queen and king. White's in very serious trouble now. White is thinking, well, here's what white's thinking. I took the rook, he took my rook. I moved the bishop here, he took here, I took here. It's black's move. Black will take the bishop with the queen, and I get that bishop. That's what white's thinking. I'm okay. That's what the surface is. There's a hidden move for black. Black's going to lose this bishop no matter what he does, right? And white's going to lose that bishop. It's black's move. If you're going to lose a piece, why give it away cheaply? If you can capture something with that piece, you should do it. When you have a piece that you're going to lose, it's called a desperado from Western terms. That you can throw that bishop and take something because you're going to lose it anyway. So the correct move is not queen takes bishop. It's to take the pawn. And if the king takes the pawn, then you could take the bishop and you won a pawn, you see. But there's even a more hideous problem for white. If king takes bishop, you don't take this bishop. The queen comes here checking the king. Now, the queen is here and the knight here. They're attacking the little king, and there's only one pawn to hide behind. The check is here. If he goes here, he's wedged in the corner, and the queen guards all these squares. The knight drops down here, checkmate. If it wasn't checkmate, he'd win the queen, but he doesn't even need that. That's a checkmate. So if the king takes queen check, the king has to go here. Then there's a queen check here, and the king goes here, and the queen comes down here, check, and the king goes up here. You think the king belongs up here in the middle of the board? Black has a totally won game. So white sees his problem. He didn't see it 3 or 4 moves ago. He thought he was okay. He has to move the queen here to guard against this check. So that's what he does. Now white is hoping, okay, I lost a pawn, but now he'll take the bishop. I got the check covered, and then I take the bishop with the queen or the king, and I lost a pawn, but at least my pieces are even, and I still got 2, 4, 6. There's still 6 pawns versus 6 pawns because white was a pawn up. So white thinks he can get a draw. Well, remember, this little guy is still a desperado. Now, he can't take anything, but this white queen wants to stop the check here, right? This little guy can move here and attack the queen, drawing the queen back here away from here, and then the black queen can come up here and check. White didn't see that. Paul Karras saw that, but he was the top 10 player in the world. So he attacks the queen. Now the queen has to take it, and the queen comes up with check. I told you the king can't go in the corner. This is still a checkmate. So he goes over here, and now we get the bishop not with the queen, with the rook. Now let's look at our position. This rook can't move. It's wedged behind a pawn and a knight. This knight can't go here. Knight takes knight check. This is not a good square for it. Knight takes knight, and he has weak double pawns. And if he goes up here, he's on the side of the board. He can't go here because of this pawn. He's out of play on the side of the board, but at least the rook could come over. In the meantime, black can bring the rook here, here, and attack, or here, here. Plus, black is threatening to win this pawn. Queen takes pawn's a threat. White resigns. There's no defense. What happened was white let black get ahead with more pieces out. See how he has a pawn, a knight, and a queen? 3 pieces. He's only got 1. The pawns in front of his king have been destroyed. White doesn't have a chance, plus black's threatening to win this. Then he'll have 2, 4, 5. Against 6, he'll be a pawn up, and a grandmaster, even if white had better pieces, a grandmaster could win a pawn up. In this case, black's going to get the pawn and have a strong attack. After queen takes pawn, he'll threaten queen takes pawn down here. So white's totally lost and resigns. And this is an important thing to know. So I didn't know about it. So getting back to this position, when I played many speed chess games, and I always played the bishop to d7 line. I never dreamed I could get away with the counterattack, but now I'm going to play bishop to c5. Well, it turns out that white mishandled this opening right here. White castled. That's his fatal mistake. The move that would have held an even position for white is a developing move. That's not really surprising. He could have moved his bishop here. See how it protects the knight on d4 and protects the pawn on f2 and renews the threat of knight takes knight, pawn takes knight, bishop takes pawn check, winning the black rook. That's the right move. And we'll run through that real quick. This is another game played later on, and I guess the players knew the right way to play. So again, I'll just run through it. They played a little different order. Remember, the bishop came out and then the knight came to f6. He's playing pawn to queen 4 early, but it's going to transpose right here. And then the knight, and we're in the same position. Pawn up, pin the knight, knight up, knight takes pawn. Our good move, bishop c5, but now the right move for white, protecting everything. Black castles. He still gives up the pawn, but there's no check. Bishop takes the pawn. Oh, wait a minute. Right here, you can't do bishop takes pawn because black would do bishop takes, pawn takes, and it's starting to look like that other game, isn't it? With the pawn here and the queen here, check. White taking that pawn, this pawn would be a blunder because what he has to do, he has to take the bishop first. So he takes the bishop, and now the knight on the center gets drawn back to black's 4th row when he recaptures, you see. So that knight here is not nearly as threatening as it was here, attacking here, back here. And you see these pawns are still in front. The king's going to castle and have a nice wall of pawns in front of him. There's no pawn up here. White's nice and safe this time. So white can take the pawn. Now there's no bishop here on the rook. There's no rook here. He has to move the rook out of the way of the bishop. That gives us time to take this pawn with the queen. And right now white is 2 pawns up. But black has a counterattack. That rook can take this pawn. And his king hasn't castled. Black's castled. White has a queen and bishop. Black has a knight, rook, and queen. But he has a problem. His knight's threatened, and white might trade queens. And if black does queen takes queen, then bishop takes. Well, black doesn't want to trade queens. He's 2 pawns down. If you're 2 pawns down, you want to attack your enemy pawns and get some of those pawns back. You want to keep the game complicated. So he needs to protect the knight. He can't move the knight. White could take the queen. The right move is the queen moves up to the black square, protecting the knight, and making way for the rook to come over here can drive the queen away from the middle of the board. White castles, he gets his pawn back. Now black's only 1 pawn down, and these 3 pawns are weak. Black's going to get another pawn. White's behind in development now, so he brings his knight out. As I told you, black brings his rook over and forces the queen back. Now black has a good move with the knight. He retreats here, but he's going to come up here, attack the queen and bishop. And the queen can protect the bishop. He doesn't win the bishop, but he'll take the bishop, and the queen comes here, and then the bishop will come here attacking the queen and starting an attack down toward the white king. That's called a counterattack. Well, white sees this, so he sees that there's only 1 black rook defending the back row. He's going to take his rook that's not doing anything, move it here, and swap out the black rook. That will reduce black's attacking chances. So he goes here. Black carries out his knight fork. The queen has to move. He takes the bishop. And as I said, the bishop comes up attacking the queen. The rook here protects the bishop. The queen moves. Now, black would like to do queen takes pawn, which is undefended, but then it would be rook takes rook checkmate. The queen is defending the rook. The rook needs to move. He moves over. Now the threat is queen takes pawn, winning the game. White is going to lose that pawn. It's a pawn desperado. He moves it up to force the trade of queens. Queen takes. Queen takes. You can't do rook takes because the rook down checkmate. So you have to take with the pawn. So white gave up a pawn, but he messed up black's pawn structure, and this pawn blocks the rook, keeps it from coming down. That's very important. And this rook can come up and attack these pawns. Maybe, maybe not. See how this rook and the bishop are on the same line? This rook threatens this pawn. White is going to take this rook, which is doing nothing. It's behind a pawn. Move it here. And if the rook takes the pawn, he gets the bishop. And if the rook takes here, this rook takes back, threatening the bishop, winning white another move. This is a good move by white. Leads to an even position. Black takes the pawn, bishop, but now they agreed to a draw in view of rook takes knight, white gets that pawn, and black moves up here. Pawns are even, 4 pawns. They both have 2 rooks. And it's completely even ending, so they agreed to a draw. That's the correct way white can hold the position but not win it against the bishop to c5 line. Well, the interesting thing is, now that we know, remember, this all started out because white aggressively moved the pawn up here, leading to all these trades, but it led to an even game, didn't it? This aggressive move. Well, guess what the grandmasters are doing now? They're not playing that move anymore. They know it's a draw. Now what they're doing, is, well, let me back up. First you get the bishop out, and then the knight comes out. So there's our 2 knights. Now they don't move 2 squares, they move 1 square. They're being conservative. They build a strong center with that pawn chain. See how the bishop's outside the pawn chain. It's not blocked by the white pawns. And white's going to slowly build up an attack and not allow the trade of pawns and pieces, which lead to equality. This is how they're playing it now. It's much more complicated. And that's what we'll go through next week.